David's old Honda coughed and wheezed as it climbed the winding mountain road. The engine made that awful grinding sound again, the same one that started 3 weeks ago when everything in his life fell apart. He gripped the steering wheel tighter and pressed the gas pedal, willing the car to make it just a few more miles. The city skyline had disappeared hours ago, replaced by tall pine trees and rocky cliffs. David couldn't believe he was actually doing this. 6 months ago, he was sitting in a corner office, wearing expensive suits and eating lunch at fancy restaurants. Now he was driving to some tiny mountain village with nothing but 2 suitcases. And what little money he had left, the job loss hit him first. Budget cuts, they said, nothing personal. Then came the divorce papers. Lisa couldn't handle being married to someone who had no ambition anymore. Her words still stung. The final blow was losing the apartment when he couldn't make rent. His so-called friends stopped returning his calls once they realized he couldn't afford to go out anymore. David pulled over at a gas station and checked his phone. The GPS showed he was still 20 minutes away from Pine Ridge. He'd found the place online while searching for the cheapest rent in the state. A small cabin for $300 a month. It seemed too good to be true, but he was desperate. Enough to take the risk. The gas station attendant was an older man with kind eyes and calloused hands. "You heading up to Pine Ridge?" he asked, noticing David's city license plates. "Yeah, just moving there actually," David replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The man nodded slowly. "Nice little place. Folks there keep to themselves mostly, but they're good people. You picked a tough time to move up there, though. Winter's coming early this year." David's stomach dropped. He hadn't really thought about winter. City life didn't prepare you for things like chopping wood or dealing with snow. How bad does it get? Bad enough. But if you're planning to stay, they'll help you out. That's the way it is in small places like that. Just don't expect them to warm up to you right away. They've seen too many city folks come and go. 20 minutes later, David drove past a wooden sign that read Pine Ridge, population 847. The village was smaller than he'd imagined. Main Street was just a few blocks long, with a general store, a diner, a post office, and what looked like a community center. People walked slowly, stopping to chat with each other on sidewalks. It felt like stepping back in time, following the directions he'd gotten through email. David drove to the edge of town where his new home waited. The cabin sat on a small hill surrounded by pine trees. It was tiny, maybe 600 square feet, with faded blue paint and a sagging front porch. But it had windows facing the mountains and the air smelled clean and fresh. For the first time in months, David felt like he could breathe. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, met him at the door. She was small and sharp-eyed, the kind of person who probably knew everyone's business in town. "You're the young man from the city," she said, looking him up and down. "I was wondering if you'd actually show up. We get a lot of people who think mountain living sounds romantic until they realize what it really means." "I'm here to stay," David said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Mrs. Patterson handed him the keys. "We'll see about that. Rent's due on the 1st of every month. There's a wood stove for heat, but you'll need to chop your own wood. The nearest neighbor is half a mile down the road, so don't expect anyone to come running if you get into trouble." She drove away. David stood in his new living room and tried not to panic. The cabin was basically furnished, but everything looked like it came from a thrift store 30 years ago. The kitchen had a small refrigerator, an old stove, and a table for 2. The bedroom barely fit a double bed. There was no dishwasher, no garbage disposal, no central air conditioning. Just the basics. He spent the first few days getting settled and trying to figure out how to live without all the conveniences he'd taken for granted. The wood stove was a mystery that took him 3 tries to figure out. He burned his first attempt at cooking dinner because the old stove heated differently than his electric one in the city. When his cell phone died, he realized there was no cell tower close enough for reliable service. On his 4th day, David walked into town to buy groceries. The general store was cramped and dimly lit, with narrow aisles packed floor to ceiling with everything from canned goods to fishing gear. An older man behind the counter watched him carefully as he picked out bread, milk, and other basics. "You're the one renting Mrs. Patterson's place," the man said. It wasn't a question. "That's right, I'm David, Frank Morrison. I run this place." Frank's handshake was firm but brief. "You planning to stick around or just passing through like the others?" "I'm planning to stay." David was getting tired of everyone assuming he'd leave. Frank nodded but didn't look convinced. "Well, if you need anything, this is pretty much the only place to get it unless you want to drive 40 minutes to the bigger town. We close at 6? And we're closed Sundays." As David was leaving the store, he nearly collided with a woman carrying a large box of supplies. She was probably in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of tan that came from spending time outdoors. When she looked up at him, he was struck by her brown eyes, which seemed to see right through him. "Sorry about that," he said, steadying her box before it could fall. "No problem," she replied, but her voice was polite and distant. She glanced at him for just a moment, then looked away quickly, as if she was trying not to be curious about the stranger in town. David wanted to say something else, maybe introduce himself, but she was already walking toward a pickup truck parked outside. He watched her load the box and drive away, wondering who she was and why he felt so nervous around her. That evening, David sat on his porch as the sun set behind the mountains. The silence was overwhelming after months of city noise. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just wind through the trees and the distant sound of water running over rocks. He thought about his old life and how empty it had felt, even with all its comforts and conveniences. Here, he didn't have much, but somehow the emptiness felt different. It felt like possibility instead of despair. A pickup truck drove slowly past his cabin, and David caught a glimpse of the woman from the store behind the wheel. She didn't wave or slow down, but he found himself hoping he'd see her again soon. For the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, he felt genuinely curious about something other than his own problems. As darkness settled over the mountains, David went inside and built a fire in the wood stove. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd explore the town properly. Maybe he'd even work up the courage to have a real conversation with someone. After all, if he was really going to make this place home, he'd have to start somewhere. David had been living in Pine Ridge for 2 weeks when he first heard about the rule. It happened during his third visit to Frank's general store, while he was trying to figure out which type of wood was best for his fireplace. 2 local men were talking near the hardware section, their voices low but not quite quiet enough. David pretended to study a display of work gloves while he listened. "Did you see how Tommy was looking at her during the town meeting?" one of them said. "Poor kid's got it bad. Someone ought to tell him before he makes a fool of himself." The other replied, "Everyone knows about Elena's rule? No outsiders, no exceptions." David's ears perked up at the mention of a rule, but he was more interested in the name, Elena. It had a nice sound to it. "Can you blame her, though?" the first man continued. "After what happened with her dad, and then that business with Jake. Still, it's been 5 years since Jake left? Maybe it's time she gave someone a chance. Not our place to say. Besides, you know how she feels about people who don't plan to stick around. She's not about to risk her heart on someone who might disappear when things get tough." The men moved away before David could hear more, but the conversation stuck with him. He found himself wondering who Elena was and what had happened to make her so careful about outsiders. He didn't have to wonder long. The next day, while walking through town, he saw a group of children playing in the small park near the community center. A woman was with them, organizing some kind of game that involved a lot of laughing and running around. When she turned in his direction, David realized it was the same woman he'd nearly bumped into at the store. Elena, it had to be. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, and her hair was loose around her shoulders now instead of tied back. David watched as she helped a little boy who had scraped his knee, cleaning the wound gently while distracting him with jokes. The care in her movements and the way the children gathered around her made it clear she was someone special in their lives. David started walking toward the park, thinking he might introduce himself properly this time. But as he got closer, Elena looked up and saw him approaching. Something shifted in her expression, a subtle closing off that made him stop in his tracks. She turned back to the children and began gathering them together as if their playtime was suddenly over. Feeling awkward and dismissed, David changed direction and headed to the diner instead. Maybe he could learn more about this mysterious rule everyone seemed to know about. The diner was small and cozy, with red vinyl booths and the smell of fresh coffee hanging in the air. A middle-aged waitress with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes seated him at the counter. "You're Mrs. Patterson's new tenant," she said, pouring him coffee without asking. "I'm Betty. How are you settling in?" "Still figuring things out," David admitted. "Everyone's been polite." Betty laughed. "That's small-town speak for we're watching you to see if you're worth getting to know. Don't take it personal. We've had a lot of people come through here thinking they want the simple life, only to run back to the city when winter hits or when they realize there's no Starbucks on every corner." "I'm not going anywhere," David said, and he was surprised to realize he meant it. "We'll see." Betty refilled his cup. "What's got you running away from city life anyway? Job trouble? Woman trouble?" David nearly choked on his coffee. Both, actually. Well, you picked the right place to start over. Pine Ridge is good for that, just don't expect it to be easy." Over the next few days, David made it his mission to learn more about the town and its people. He discovered that Elena taught at the elementary school and had lived in Pine Ridge her entire life. She organized most of the community events, helped elderly residents with errands, and seemed to know everyone's birthday, anniversary, and personal struggles. The more he learned about her, the more intrigued he became. But he also began to understand the weight of the rule that surrounded her. It was Mrs. Patterson who finally explained it to him directly. She'd stopped by to check on the cabin's heating system and found David struggling to repair a loose window frame. "You're trying too hard," she said, watching him fumble with a screwdriver. "The window or something else?" David asked. Mrs. Patterson gave him a sharp look. "I've seen you watching Elena Rodriguez, and I've seen how she's been avoiding certain streets when she knows you might be walking them." David felt his face flush. "I wasn't trying to bother her. I just thought it would be nice to meet more people in town." "Elena's a special case," Mrs. Patterson said, taking the screwdriver from his hands and fixing the window with practiced efficiency. "When she was 12, her father took off for California with some woman he met at a truck stop. Left Elena and her mother with nothing but debt and broken promises." David winced. "That's terrible." "Gets worse. When Elena was 22, she got engaged to Jake Morrison, Frank's nephew. Nice boy, grew up here. Everyone thought they were perfect for each other. Then Jake got offered a job in Denver. Big company, good money, all that. He wanted Elena to come with him, but she wouldn't leave. This place is a whole world. Her mother was sick at the time, needed taking care of. The school needed her. The community needed her. Jake couldn't understand why she wouldn't just pack up and follow him to the big city. Mrs. Patterson tightened the last screw with more force than necessary, so he left alone. David was quiet for a moment, processing this information. And now she doesn't trust outsiders. Can you blame her? Far as Elena's concerned, men who aren't from here will always have one foot out the door. She's not interested in getting her heart broken again by someone who's just passing through. That evening, David sat on his porch and thought about what Mrs. Patterson had told him. He understood Elena's rule now, and he respected it. But he also felt a strange sense of loss, as if something important had been taken away before he'd even had a chance to reach for it. The next few days passed quietly. David threw himself into practical tasks, learning to split wood properly and figuring out how to winterize his cabin. He avoided the school and the park where Elena might be, not wanting to make her uncomfortable, but Pine Ridge was small, and avoiding someone completely was impossible. He saw her at the post office sorting mail with quick, efficient movements. He glimpsed her at the gas station, filling up her truck and chatting with the attendant about someone's sick grandmother. Each time, she acknowledged him with a polite nod but nothing more. David began to understand that Elena's rule wasn't just about protecting herself. It was about protecting the entire community. She was their teacher, their organizer, their emotional center. If she got involved with someone who might leave, it wouldn't just break her heart. It would disrupt the careful balance that kept Pine Ridge functioning. The rule made sense. It was practical, even wise. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. One afternoon, while David was at the general store buying supplies for a leaky roof, he overheard another conversation about Elena. This time it was two women discussing. Someone named Tommy, apparently a local man who'd been trying to ask Elena out for months. She turned him down again, one woman said. Poor Tommy, he's such a sweet boy. He should know better by now, the other replied. Elena's rule isn't just about outsiders. She doesn't date anyone, period, not since Jake. David felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. If Elena wouldn't even consider dating local men, then her avoidance of him wasn't personal. But it also meant she'd built walls around her heart that seemed impossible to climb. As he walked home that day, David made a decision. He would respect Elena's rule completely. He wouldn't try to change her mind or prove himself worthy of an exception. But he also wouldn't let the rule stop him from becoming part of Pine Ridge in his own way. If he couldn't win Elena's heart, maybe he could at least earn her respect by proving that not every outsider was destined to leave. Maybe in time he could show the whole community that some people were worth trusting, even if they came from somewhere else. It was a small hope, but it was enough to keep him going. The storm hit Pine Ridge on a Tuesday night in late October, bringing the worst weather David had seen since moving to the mountains. Rain pounded against his cabin windows like angry fists, and the wind howled through the pine trees with a sound that made him grateful for solid walls and a warm fire. David had spent the evening reading an old paperback novel he'd found in the cabin, trying to ignore the weather outside. Around 9 o'clock, the lights flickered twice and then went out completely. He fumbled for the flashlight he'd learned to keep handy and checked the wood stove to make sure it was burning safely. The power outages were something he was still getting used to. In the city, losing electricity was rare and usually fixed within hours. Here in the mountains, storms could knock out power for days. Mrs. Patterson had warned him to always keep candles, batteries, and extra firewood on hand. By 10 o'clock. The worst of the storm seemed to be passing. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and the wind wasn't shaking the cabin anymore. David was getting ready for bed when he heard a car engine struggling somewhere outside. He looked out his front window but couldn't see anything in the darkness. The sound came again, a car trying to start but failing. Then he heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of someone hitting a steering wheel in frustration. David grabbed his flashlight and rain jacket. He couldn't just ignore someone who might be in trouble, especially on a night like this. He stepped outside and immediately felt the cold rain soaking through his clothes, despite the jacket. Following the sound, he walked down his driveway toward the main road. About 50 yards away, he could see the dim outline of a pickup truck pulled over on the shoulder. The hazard lights were blinking weakly, suggesting the battery was running low. As he got closer, David could see someone sitting in the driver's seat. When he tapped on the window, the person inside jumped slightly before rolling it down. It was Elena. Her hair was damp and messy, and she looked tired and frustrated. For a moment, they just stared at each other in surprise. Car trouble? David asked, stating the obvious because he couldn't think of anything else to say. It just died, Elena said, her voice tight with worry. I was coming back from visiting Mrs. Henderson. She's been sick, and the engine just stopped. David could hear the exhaustion in her voice. How long have you been sitting here? About 20 minutes. I keep trying to start it, but nothing happens. She turned the key again to demonstrate, and the engine made a weak clicking sound. Pop the hood, David said. Let me take a look. Elena hesitated for a moment, and David could see her internal struggle. Accepting help from him would mean breaking her own rule about keeping distance from outsiders. But she was stuck on a dark road in the middle of nowhere with a dead car. Finally, She pulled the hood release. David lifted the hood and shined his flashlight on the engine. He wasn't a mechanic, but he'd learned some basic car maintenance out of necessity when money was tight. The problem was obvious immediately. "Your battery cables are corroded," he called over the sound of rain, "and one of them came loose. That's why it won't start." He found a wrench in the toolbox in his truck and managed to clean the connections and tighten the loose cable. It took about 10 minutes of getting soaked, but when Elena tried the key again, the engine roared to life. "Thank you," she said through the open window, and for the first time since he'd arrived in Pine Ridge, she looked directly at him without that guarded expression. "No problem, but you should get to a garage soon. These cables need to be replaced properly." Elena nodded, then paused as if debating something with herself. "I know this is going to sound presumptuous, but would you like a ride back to your cabin? You're soaked." David looked down at himself. She was right, he was completely drenched and shivering. "If you don't mind, that would be great." The short ride to his cabin was quiet at first, with only the sound of windshield wipers and the heater running. But as they pulled into his driveway, Elena surprised him by speaking first. "I heard you've been volunteering to help Mr. Peterson with his roof," she said. David shrugged. "The old man shouldn't be climbing ladders at his age. Besides, I needed something to do with my time. And Mrs. Cheen mentioned you helped her move that old refrigerator to the curb." "It wasn't a big deal." Elena turned off the engine and looked at him. "It is a big deal, actually. People notice when someone new makes an effort to help without being asked." They sat in the truck for a moment, and David felt like they were having two conversations at once. The surface conversation about helping neighbors, and an underneath conversation about whether he was the kind of person who could be trusted. "I should let you get inside before you catch pneumonia," Elena said finally. David opened the truck door, then hesitated. "Elena, can I ask you something?" She tensed slightly. "What?" "That book you were carrying at the school yesterday. Was it To Kill a Mockingbird?" Elena looked surprised by the question. "Yes, we're reading it with the 6th graders." "Why? It's one of my favorite books. I must have read it 10 times. David smiled. "I was an English major in college before I got into the corporate world." "Really?" For the first time, Elena's guard seemed to drop completely. "What did you think about the way Harper Lee handled the theme of moral courage?" And just like that, they were talking. Not about car trouble or the weather or small-town politeness, but about books and ideas and the kinds of things David hadn't discussed with anyone in months. They talked about literature for 20 minutes, sitting in Elena's truck in David's driveway while the rain drummed on the roof. Elena was smart and thoughtful, with opinions that showed she'd really thought about what she'd read. David found himself relaxing for the first time since moving to Pine Ridge. "I can't believe I'm sitting here having a conversation about symbolism in American literature," Elena said with a small laugh. "This is not how I expected my evening to go." "Mine either," David admitted. "But it's the best conversation I've had in a long time." Elena's smile faded a little, as if she'd suddenly remembered something. "I should go. It's late, and tomorrow's a school day." David sensed the moment was ending and that Elena was pulling her walls back up. "Of course. Thanks for the ride." He got out of the truck and watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing. Around the bend, standing in his driveway, still dripping wet, but somehow feeling warmer than he had in weeks, David realized something had changed between them. The next few days were different. When David went to town for supplies, Elena didn't avoid eye contact anymore. She didn't seek him out, but she didn't actively avoid him either. At the post office, she said hello and asked how his roof repair was going. At the general store, she mentioned a book she thought he might like. These were small things, tiny cracks in the wall she'd built around herself. But for David, they felt huge. He started volunteering more around town. Not to impress Elena, but because helping others made him feel useful in a way his old job never had. He helped Frank organize inventory at the store. He joined the volunteer fire department, even though he had no experience fighting fires. He attended town meetings and actually contributed ideas instead of just sitting quietly in the back. Slowly, David began to feel like he might actually belong in Pine Ridge. And sometimes, when he caught Elena watching him help load groceries for an elderly resident or organize supplies for the food bank, he thought maybe she was beginning to see him differently too, but he was careful not to push. Elena's rule existed for good reasons, and David respected that. If anything was going to change between them, it would have to happen naturally. Still, as autumn deepened and the first snow began to dust the mountain peaks, David found himself hoping that maybe, just maybe, rules were sometimes meant to be reconsidered. The annual Harvest Festival was the biggest event in Pine Ridge all year. David had heard people talking about it for weeks, but nothing prepared him for the transformation of the town when the day finally arrived. Main Street was decorated with pumpkins, corn stalks, and colorful autumn leaves. The smell of apple cider and roasted corn filled the air. Local vendors had set up booths selling everything from homemade jam to hand-carved wooden toys. A small stage had been erected in front of the community center, where a local band was playing country music that echoed through the mountains. David walked through the festival feeling both amazed and out of place. Everyone seemed to know each other, sharing inside jokes and catching up on family news. Children ran between the booths with sticky fingers and huge smiles. Elderly couples sat on hay bales, watching their grandchildren play games they'd probably played at this same festival decades ago. He'd been living in Pine Ridge for almost 2 months now, and while people were friendlier to him than when he'd first arrived, he still felt like an observer rather than a participant. The festival made that feeling even stronger. First Harvest Festival? Betty from the diner appeared beside him, carrying a paper plate loaded with food. "Is it that obvious?" David asked. "You have that lost tourist look," she said with a grin. "Come on, let me show you around properly. You can't just stand there watching like you're at a museum." Betty led him through the festival, introducing him to people he'd seen around town but never really met. There was Dr. Williams, who'd been the town's only doctor for 30 years, Mrs. Foster, who ran the library out of her living room since the town couldn't afford a real building. Tom Bradley, a carpenter who'd built half the houses in Pine Ridge with his own hands. Each introduction was brief but warm. People seemed genuinely interested in how David was settling in, whether he'd figured out how to use his wood stove properly, if he needed help preparing for winter. It was the kind of community care David had never experienced in the city. As evening approached, the band took a break and people began gathering around the small dance floor that had been set up in the street. The older couples took the floor first, moving to slow country songs with the ease of people who'd been dancing together for decades. David found himself standing at the edge of the crowd, watching and feeling that familiar sense of being on the outside looking in. That's when he saw Elena. She was sitting alone at a picnic table near the dance floor, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes. Her hair was down and curled slightly, and she looked more relaxed than David had ever seen her. But she was alone, and something about the way she was watching the dancing couples made her seem sad. David had been careful to keep his distance since the night she'd helped him with his car. They'd had a few more brief conversations around town, but nothing like that evening when they'd talked about books and ideas. Elena had been polite but careful, as if she was reminding herself not to get too comfortable around him. Now, watching her sit alone while everyone else celebrated, David felt something twist in his chest. The smart thing would be to leave her alone, to respect the boundaries she'd clearly established. But she looked so lonely, and the music was soft and inviting. And before he could talk himself out of it, David was walking toward her table. "Elena," he said when he reached her, "would you like to dance?" The question hung in the air between them. Elena looked up at him with surprise, then glanced around as if suddenly aware that people might be watching. David could see the internal battle playing out on her face. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said finally, but her voice was soft, not harsh. "It's just a dance," David said. "One song." Elena looked at the dancing couples again, then back at David. For a moment he thought she was going to say no. Then, almost against her better judgment, she stood up. "One song," she agreed quietly. David led her onto the dance floor, acutely aware that conversations around them had quieted and people were watching. He put one hand gently on Elena's waist and took her hand with the other, keeping a respectful distance between them. They moved slowly to the music, and David was surprised by how natural it felt. Elena was a good dancer, following his lead easily. For a few minutes, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. There was just the music, the warm evening air, and the woman in his arms. "You're a good dancer," Elena said, looking up at him. "My mom made me take lessons when I was 12, David admitted. "I hated it at the time, but I guess it paid off." Elena smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I'm glad she did." The song was ending too soon. As the last notes played, David found himself reluctant to let go of Elena's hand. They stood there for a moment, closer than they'd ever been, and David thought he saw something in her eyes that matched what he was feeling. Then reality crashed back in. David became aware of the silence around them. The conversations that had stopped when they started dancing hadn't resumed. People were staring, some with curiosity, others with what looked like disapproval. Elena noticed it too, and the spell was broken. "I should go," she said, stepping back quickly. "Elena, wait!" But she was already walking away, moving quickly through the crowd toward her truck. David started to follow her, then stopped when he realized that would only make things worse. He looked around at the faces watching him. Some people looked sympathetic, others seemed uncomfortable. A few were shaking their heads as if he'd done something terrible. "Well, that was interesting." Betty appeared beside him again. "You know you just broke the biggest unspoken rule in Pine Ridge, right?" "I just asked her to dance," David said defensively. "Honey, you might as well have announced your engagement. Elena hasn't danced with anyone since Jake left town. People are going to talk about this for weeks." David felt his stomach drop. He'd been trying so hard to fit in, to prove that he belonged in Pine Ridge. Now he'd done something that would have the whole town gossiping about him and Elena. The next few days were uncomfortable. When David went to the general store, conversations stopped when he walked in. People were still polite, but there was an awkwardness that hadn't been there before. Frank was particularly cool toward him, barely making eye contact when David bought supplies. Worst of all, Elena was avoiding him completely. She changed her route to school so she wouldn't pass his cabin. When he went to town, she seemed to vanish from wherever she'd been moments before. The few times he caught glimpses of her from a distance, she looked stressed and unhappy. David realized he'd made a terrible mistake. By asking Elena to dance, he'd put her in an impossible position. Everyone in town knew about her rule, and by accepting his invitation, she'd appeared to break it publicly. Now she was dealing with questions and pressure from people who cared about her but didn't understand why she'd made an exception for him. A week after the festival, Mrs. Patterson stopped by the cabin again. This time, she didn't bother with the pretense of checking on repairs. "You stirred up quite a hornet's nest," she said, settling into one of his kitchen chairs. "I didn't mean to cause problems for Elena," David said. "I know you didn't. But intent doesn't always matter when it comes to small-town politics." Mrs. Patterson studied him carefully. "The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" "What do you mean?" "Elena's getting pressure from all sides. People asking her if she's changing her mind about outsiders, if she's planning to leave Pine Ridge with you when you inevitably decide mountain life isn't for you. Some folks think she's being foolish. Others think you're taking advantage of her kindness." David felt sick. "I never wanted any of that." "Then you need to back off," Mrs. Patterson said bluntly. "Give her space to sort out her feelings without the whole town watching every interaction between you two." That evening, David wrote Elena a letter. He apologized for putting her in a difficult position and promised to respect her wishes for distance. He left it in her mailbox and then made good on his promise by staying away from town for several days. But even as he honored Elena's need for space, David couldn't stop thinking about those few minutes on the dance floor. For just a moment, Elena had let her guard down completely. She'd looked at him like he was someone worth caring about, someone who might be worth taking a risk for. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right and he needed to back off. But David couldn't shake the feeling that Elena's avoidance wasn't just about protecting herself from gossip. It was about protecting herself from feelings she wasn't ready to face. As November brought colder weather and shorter days, David threw himself into preparing for winter and helping other people do the same. He chopped wood for elderly neighbors, helped weatherproof houses, and organized a food drive for families who might struggle during the harsh mountain winter. He didn't do these things to impress Elena or anyone else. He did them because Pine Ridge was becoming his home, and taking care of your community was what you did when you belonged somewhere. But sometimes, when he was working outside, he'd catch sight of Elena's truck driving past. And sometimes, if he was lucky, she'd slow down just a little, as if part of her wanted to stop and talk. Those moments gave David hope that maybe, despite everything, the dance they'd shared had meant something to her too. November in Pine Ridge was supposed to bring snow and cold, steady rain that would soak the mountain forests and prepare them for winter's deep freeze. Instead, the weather turned strange and unsettling in ways that made David's skin crawl with worry. Day after day, the sun blazed down from cloudless skies, turning what should have been soggy autumn leaves into crispy brown fragments that crumbled at the slightest touch. The mountain streams that had rushed with snowmelt and rain all summer began to shrink, revealing rocky bottoms that hadn't seen sunlight in years. David noticed it first during his morning walks. He developed a routine of hiking the trails around his cabin before breakfast, partly for exercise and partly because the solitude helped him think. 3 weeks after the harvest festival, as he walked the same path he'd taken dozens of times, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. The birds that usually chattered in the trees were gone, and the small animals that normally rustled through the undergrowth had disappeared. When David knelt to examine the trail, he found deer tracks heading downhill toward the valley. As if the wildlife was abandoning the upper elevations, even more troubling were the trees themselves. The pine needles, which should have been green and supple, were turning brown and brittle. When David broke off a small branch, it snapped like a matchstick, dry and lifeless despite the fact that these trees had thrived on this mountain for decades. David had spent 2 summers working for the Forest Service during college, mostly doing trail maintenance and campground cleanup. It hadn't been glamorous work, but it had taught him to recognize the signs of drought stress and fire danger. What he was seeing now scared him more than anything he'd encountered in those summers. The humidity was wrong. When David checked the weather station data on his phone, the readings showed humidity levels that belonged in a desert, not in a mountain forest that should have been preparing for winter. The seasonal rainfall was months behind normal, and the extended forecast showed no relief in sight. But what worried David most was how normal everyone else seemed to think this was. "Beautiful weather we're having," Frank commented when David stopped by the general store for supplies. "Can't remember the last time we had such a nice November." "Doesn't it seem a little too dry?" David asked carefully. Frank shrugged. "Weather goes in cycles. We had a wet summer, so maybe nature's balancing things out. Besides, I'm not complaining about not having to shovel snow yet." David tried bringing up his concerns with other people around town, but got similar responses. The older residents talked about dry spells they remembered from decades past, insisting that the mountains always took care of themselves eventually. The younger people were too busy enjoying the unseasonably warm weather to worry about what it might mean. Even Dr. Williams, who David had come to respect for his practical wisdom, seemed unconcerned when David mentioned the strange conditions during a chance meeting at the post office. "You city folks always worry about things we mountain people take in stride," the doctor said with a patient smile. "The weather up here has been unpredictable for as long as anyone can remember. A few weeks of dry weather isn't going to hurt anything." David wanted to argue, to explain that this wasn't just a few weeks of dry weather, but a dangerous combination of factors that could turn the entire mountainside into a tinderbox. But he could see in Dr. Williams' eyes the same polite dismissal he'd gotten from everyone else. To them, he was still the outsider who didn't understand how things worked in Pine Ridge. The frustration was eating at him. David had spent hours researching fire conditions online. Comparing the current weather patterns to historical data from major forest fires, everything he found confirmed his worst fears. The combination of drought, low humidity, and unseasonably high temperatures was creating exactly the conditions that had led to devastating wildfires in other mountain communities. But whenever he tried to share this information, people listened politely and then dismissed his concerns as the overreaction of someone who didn't understand mountain life. The situation became even more complicated because of Elena. Since the harvest festival, she'd been avoiding him so completely that David felt like a ghost haunting the edges of her life. He saw her truck parked at the school or the community center, but she always seemed to vanish before he could catch a glimpse of her. David knew that Elena cared deeply about Pine Ridge and its safety. If anyone would listen to his concerns about fire danger, it would be her. But approaching Elena now would only make her uncomfortable and add to the gossip that was still circulating about their dance at the festival. So David found himself in an impossible position. The one person who might take his warning seriously was the one person he couldn't talk to without causing problems for both of them. As November stretched on and the dangerous conditions worsened, David's anxiety grew into something close to panic. He started taking longer hikes, venturing higher up the mountain to assess the conditions firsthand. What he found made his worst fears seem optimistic. The forest floor was carpeted with dead leaves and fallen branches that cracked underfoot, like broken glass. Streams that should have been flowing with winter runoff had dried up completely. The trees themselves looked sick, their bark cracking in the heat and their needles falling in brown showers with every gust of wind. Most disturbing of all, David found evidence that people had been camping illegally in the national forest above the town. Scattered beer cans, cigarette butts, and the remains of several campfires told the story of visitors who either didn't know or didn't care about fire. Restrictions. One afternoon, while hiking a trail about 2 miles above Pine Ridge, David discovered a campsite that made his blood run cold. Someone had built a large fire ring surrounded by dry brush and dead trees. The ashes were cold, but recent enough that they might have been from the night before. Whoever had camped there had left behind empty bottles, food wrappers, and worst of all, cigarette butts scattered around the fire pit. David spent an hour carefully extinguishing every ember he could find and scattering the ashes to make sure nothing was still smoldering. Then he hiked back to town with his heart pounding, knowing he had to do something but not sure what. That evening, David attended the monthly town council meeting. He'd been going to these meetings since moving to Pine Ridge, partly to understand how the community worked and partly to show that he was committed to being a good citizen. The meetings were usually quiet affairs, with discussions about road maintenance, budget issues, and planning for community events. But when the mayor asked if anyone had new business to discuss, David stood up. "I'd like to talk about fire safety," he said, trying to keep his voice calm and professional. A few people shifted in their seats, and David saw Mayor Thompson exchange a glance with Frank Morrison. They were probably expecting another outsider complaint about something they'd been handling just fine for generations. David had prepared for this moment, organizing his thoughts and evidence into the most compelling case he could make. He talked about the drought conditions, the humidity readings, the stressed vegetation, and the illegal camping he'd discovered. He explained how these factors combined to create extreme fire danger and suggested immediate measures like posting warning signs, increasing patrols, and preparing evacuation plans. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "We appreciate your concern, David," he said in a tone that suggested he didn't appreciate it at all. "But I think you might be overreacting to normal seasonal variations. Pine Ridge has been here for over 100 years, and we've survived plenty of dry spells." "This isn't just a dry spell," David insisted. "The conditions right now are exactly what fire experts warn about. If something starts a fire up there, it could spread faster than anyone expects." Frank Morrison spoke up from the back of the room. "With respect, David, you've been here for what? 3 months? Some of us have lived in these mountains our whole lives. We know how to judge our own risks." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the small crowd. David looked around the room, seeing polite but skeptical faces everywhere. These people trusted their own experience more than they trusted his warnings, and he couldn't blame them for that. He was still the outsider, asking them to believe that he understood their home better than they did. But what frustrated David most was seeing Elena in the back corner of the room. She'd been listening intently to everything he said, and unlike everyone else, she didn't look dismissive. If anything, she looked worried. But when the mayor called for a vote on David's proposals, Elena remained silent. The council voted down every suggestion David had made. No additional fire patrols, no warning signs, no evacuation planning, nothing. As people filed out of the meeting, David felt more alone than he had since arriving in Pine Ridge. He tried to do the right thing, to use his knowledge to protect the community that was becoming his home. Instead, he probably just reinforced everyone's belief that he was an anxious outsider who didn't belong, walking home under a star-filled sky that should have been hidden by November clouds. David made a decision that he knew might cost him any chance of truly belonging in Pine Ridge. If the community wouldn't listen to his warnings, he'd have to go around them. David stared at his phone for 20 minutes before finally dialing the number. His hands were shaking slightly as he waited for someone to answer at the county fire department. Every part of him knew that making this call would change everything between him and Pine Ridge, but he couldn't live with the alternative. County Fire Department, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking. Hi, my name is David Chun. I'm calling about potential fire danger in the Pine Ridge area. There was a pause. Are you reporting an active fire? No, but I'm very concerned about conditions that could lead to one. I live in Pine Ridge, and I've been monitoring the drought conditions, humidity levels, and vegetation stress. I also found evidence of illegal camping with uncontrolled fires in the forest above town. Captain Rodriguez's tone became more serious. Can you give me specific locations and details? For the next 30 minutes, David shared everything he'd observed and documented. The captain asked detailed questions about wind patterns, vegetation types, and the exact locations where he'd found abandoned campsites. David could hear the man taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions that suggested he was taking the concerns seriously. Mr. Chun, I have to ask, have you reported these conditions to local authorities? David felt his stomach twist. I tried. I brought it up at the town council meeting, but they voted down any additional safety measures. They think I'm overreacting because I'm new to the area. I see. Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Well, fire danger doesn't care about local politics. We'll send a team up there within the next few days to assess the situation. If conditions are as bad as you describe, we'll implement county-level fire restrictions whether the local council likes it or not. After hanging up, David felt both relief and dread. He'd done what he thought was right, but he knew there would be consequences. Going around the town council and calling in outside authorities was exactly the kind of thing that would confirm everyone's suspicions that he didn't respect local ways of doing things. The consequences came faster than he expected. 2 days later, David was at the general store buying groceries when Frank Morrison confronted him near the checkout counter. Frank's usual polite demeanor was gone, replaced by barely controlled anger. I heard you called the county fire department, Frank said, his voice loud enough that other customers stopped their conversations to listen. David felt every eye in the store turn toward him. I was concerned about fire safety. You were concerned about making us look like idiots who can't take care of our own community. Frank stepped closer, and David could see how upset he really was. Do you have any idea what you've done? Now we've got county officials crawling all over our mountain, treating us like children who don't know how to manage our own backyard. Frank, I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I was trying to prevent a disaster by going behind our backs, by calling in outsiders to override decisions made by people who've lived here their whole lives. Frank's voice was rising, and more people were gathering to watch the confrontation. This is exactly why Elena's rule exists. This is exactly why we don't trust people like you. The words hit David like a physical blow. People like you. outsiders who couldn't be trusted to respect local traditions and authority. David looked around the store and saw the same sentiment reflected in other faces: disappointment, anger, and the kind of hurt that came from feeling betrayed by someone they'd started to accept. "I'm sorry you feel that way," David said quietly. "But I'd rather have you angry at me than have this town burned down because I kept quiet." Frank shook his head in disgust. "You just don't get it, do you? This isn't about fire safety. This is about respect. And you've shown that you don't have any for this community or the people in it." David left the store with his groceries and the weight of knowing that he'd just undone months of careful relationship building. As he walked to his truck, he could feel people watching him through the store windows, and he knew the story of this confrontation would spread through Pine Ridge within hours. That evening, Mrs. Patterson stopped by his cabin. David had been expecting this visit, but it didn't make it any easier. "You've really stepped in it this time," she said, settling into his kitchen chair with a heavy sigh. "I know, but Mrs. Patterson, the conditions up there are dangerous. If you could see what I've seen... That's not the point, and you know it?" Her voice was sharp with disappointment. "The point is that you went around the people of this community to get what you wanted. You made us look like fools who can't be trusted to handle our own affairs." David sat down across from her, feeling exhausted. "I tried to work within the system. I presented my concerns to the town council, and they dismissed them. What was I supposed to do? Just wait and hope I was wrong? You were supposed to trust us, to believe that people who've lived here for generations might know something about surviving in these mountains." Mrs. Patterson looked older than David had ever seen her, but instead you decided that your 3 months of experience trumped our lifetime of knowledge. It's not about experience, it's about science. The weather data, the humidity readings, the vegetation stress, these are measurable things that don't care how long someone's lived here. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "You still don't understand. This isn't really about fire safety, David. This is about whether you're the kind of person who can live in a small community without trying to change it to suit your own ideas." After she left, David sat alone in his cabin and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Not about calling the fire department, he still believed that was the right thing to do. But maybe he'd been wrong to think he could ever truly belong. In Pine Ridge, the next few days were the loneliest David had experienced since moving to the mountains. People weren't openly hostile, but the warmth that had slowly been building toward him was gone. Conversations stopped when he walked into rooms. People who had been friendly now offered only polite nods. Even Betty at the diner seemed cooler, taking his order without the usual small talk. Worst of all was Elena's reaction. David had caught glimpses of her around town, and the few times their eyes met, she looked away quickly. He could see the conflict in her face, as if she was struggling with something she couldn't resolve. 3 days after his confrontation with Frank, David was surprised to find Elena waiting by his truck after he finished grocery shopping. She looked nervous and kept glancing around as if she was worried about being seen talking to him. "I need to tell you something," she said without preamble. "Elena, look, I know everyone's upset about the fire department thing. I don't want to make things worse for you by being seen talking to me. That's not what this is about." Elena took a deep breath. "I've been doing my own research since you spoke at the council meeting. About fire conditions, weather patterns, all of it." David felt a spark of hope. And you're right. The conditions are dangerous, maybe more dangerous than anything we've seen in decades." Elena's voice was quiet but firm. "I've been reading reports from other mountain communities that faced similar conditions. Some of them didn't end well." "Then why didn't you speak up at the meeting?" Elena looked away, and David could see the pain in her expression. "Because I was scared. Scared of what it would mean if I sided with you against the council, against my own community. Everyone already thinks I've been too friendly with you." Since the harvest festival, David felt his heart sink. Even when Elena agreed with him, the social pressure of the community kept her from supporting him publicly. "I understand," he said. "I know my calling the county has made things complicated. For everyone." "No, David, you don't understand. Elena looked back at him, and her eyes were filled with something that looked like regret. I should have spoken up. I should have supported you when I knew you were right. Instead, I let my fear of what people would think stop me from doing what I knew was right. They stood there in the parking lot, two people who cared about each other and about Pine Ridge, but who were trapped by circumstances neither of them had chosen. The county fire team is coming tomorrow, Elena said finally. Whatever they find, whatever happens next, I want you to know that some of us understand what you were trying to do. As Elena walked away, David felt more conflicted than ever. He'd done what he believed was right, but the cost was higher than he'd expected. He'd gained Elena's respect but lost the community's trust. He'd potentially saved lives but destroyed relationships that had taken months to build, standing alone in the parking lot. David looked up at the mountains surrounding Pine Ridge. The setting sun was painting the peaks in shades of red and orange that reminded him uncomfortably of flames. Tomorrow, county fire officials would assess the conditions he'd been warning about. Part of him hoped they would find that he'd been wrong, that his concerns were overblown and the community's confidence was justified. But deep down, David knew what they would discover. The only question was whether his warning would be enough to prevent the disaster. He could feel coming like a storm on the horizon. The next few weeks would test everything David had learned about belonging, about community, and about the sometimes painful difference between being right and being accepted. David woke up at 3 a.m. to the smell of smoke. At first, he thought it was coming from his wood stove. Half asleep, he stumbled out of bed to check if he'd left the damper open or if embers had somehow escaped onto his hearth. But the stove was cold and the smell was getting stronger, not weaker. That's when he noticed the orange glow flickering through his bedroom window. David's blood turned to ice. He rushed to the window and looked up toward the mountain ridge above. Pine Ridge. What he saw made his worst nightmares seem optimistic. A line of fire was racing down the mountainside, moving faster than anything natural should move. The dry forest he'd been warning about for weeks was burning like it had been soaked in gasoline. He grabbed his phone and called 911, his hands shaking as he tried to explain the location to the dispatcher. But even as he talked, David could see that the fire was moving too fast for normal response times. At the rate it was spreading, it would reach the edge of town within the hour. David threw on clothes and boots, grabbed his truck keys, and ran outside. The night air was thick with smoke and the sound of wind pushing flames through dry trees. He could hear propane tanks exploding in the distance as the fire consumed abandoned campsites and hunting cabins on the upper slopes. Without thinking about his own safety, David drove straight into town with his hand on the horn, creating as much noise as possible. He drove down Main Street, then through the residential neighborhoods, honking continuously and shouting out his window at every house he passed. Fire! Everyone needs to evacuate now. The mountain's on fire. Lights began coming on in windows. People stumbled out onto their porches, some in bathrobes and slippers, trying to understand what was happening. David could see the confusion and fear on their faces as they looked up, and saw the glow on the horizon. At Mrs. Henderson's house. David saw the elderly woman standing in her doorway looking lost and frightened. He pulled into her driveway and jumped out of his truck. Mrs. Henderson, we need to get you out of here right now. Can you grab some medicine and important papers while I help you to my truck? I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. What's happening? There's a wildfire coming down the mountain. We have maybe 30 minutes before it reaches town. David gently took her arm and guided her back into the house. Just grab what you absolutely need. We have to go. While Mrs. Henderson gathered a few belongings with shaking hands, David called everyone he could think of. He called Betty at the diner, Frank at the general store, Dr. Williams, even Mayor Thompson. Some people answered immediately, others took several rings. All of them sounded shocked and disbelieving until David told them to look outside. By the time David got Mrs. Henderson safely to the community center, which was being used as an evacuation point, the whole town was in motion. People were loading cars with whatever they could grab quickly. Parents were carrying sleepy children while trying to remember where they'd put their important documents. The volunteer fire department was setting up equipment, but everyone could see that their small trucks and limited water supply wouldn't be enough to stop what was coming. David drove back into the residential area to help more people evacuate. At the Peterson house, he found the elderly man trying to load a heavy chest of drawers into his car. "Mr. Peterson, there's no time for furniture," David called out. "We need to focus on people, not things. But this has all my wife's photos from before she died. I can't leave it." David looked at the advancing fire, then at the old man's desperate face. Together, they managed to get the chest into David's truck along with Mr. Peterson himself. As they drove toward the evacuation point, Mr. Peterson spoke quietly. "I owe you an apology, son. At the council meeting, I voted against your proposals. Thought you were just stirring up trouble." "None of that matters now," David said, navigating around other evacuating vehicles. "It does matter. You tried to warn us, and we didn't listen. Now look what's happened." The fire reached the edge of town just as the last residents were being evacuated. David was making one final sweep through the neighborhoods when he saw Elena's truck parked outside the school. His heart stopped. She was supposed to be at the evacuation center with everyone else. He ran into the school building and found Elena in her classroom, frantically stuffing student files and artwork into boxes. "Elena, what are you doing?" "You need to get out of here now. I'm trying to save the children's work," she said without looking up. "Some of these kids, this might be the only record of their school years if the building burns." "Elena, the fire's less than half a mile away. We have to leave right now." She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "I can't just abandon everything. This school, these kids' work, it's all I have." David could see smoke beginning to creep under the classroom door. He made a decision that probably saved both their lives. He grabbed Elena around the waist and physically carried her out of the building despite her protests. "I'm sorry," he said as he set her down next to his truck. "But you're more important than any building or any files." As they drove away from the school, Elena watched in the side mirror as flames began licking at the building's roof. She started crying then, quiet tears that broke David's heart. "I'm sorry," David said again. "I know how much that place meant to you." "No," Elena said, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you weeks ago. I'm sorry I let everyone else's opinions matter more than doing what was right." They reached the evacuation center just as the first fire trucks from neighboring counties arrived. Captain Rodriguez, the man David had spoken to on the phone, was coordinating the response from a command vehicle. "Mr. Chung," the captain called out when he saw David. "Thank God you called when you did. We've been preparing for this for days because of your warning. If we'd gotten caught off guard..." David felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. His warnings had been right, but being right felt hollow when he looked around at the faces of people who might lose their homes. The fire burned for 3 days. Professional firefighting crews from across the state worked around the clock to contain it, using helicopters to drop water and creating fire breaks to stop the flames from spreading further. Amazingly, no one was killed or seriously injured. A few buildings on the outskirts of town were damaged, including part of the school, but the main residential areas were saved. The quick evacuation that David had organized in those crucial early minutes had made all the difference. When the all-clear was finally given and people were allowed to return to their homes, David found himself standing in the parking lot of the community center, exhausted and emotionally drained. People were hugging each other, crying with relief, and beginning the process of returning to whatever normal life they could salvage. Frank Morrison approached him slowly. The man who had been so angry at David just days before now looked older and humbled. "I owe you my life," Frank said simply. "We all do, if you hadn't raised that alarm when you did... "I'm just glad everyone's safe," David replied. "No, it's more than that." Frank looked around at the crowd of people preparing to go home. "You could have stayed quiet after the way we treated you. You could have said it wasn't your problem anymore. But when the crisis came, you put our safety ahead of your own hurt feelings." Other people had begun to gather around them. David saw faces he recognized from the general store, the diner, the town council meeting where his warnings had been dismissed. Mayor Thompson stepped forward. "David, I think I speak for all of us when I say we owe you an apology. And more than that, we owe you our thanks." Elena appeared at David's side. Her face was streaked with soot and her eyes were red from smoke and tears, but she looked at him with something he'd never seen there before: complete trust. "When the fire was bearing down on us, you didn't think about yourself," she said. "You thought about protecting everyone else. That's not the action of someone who doesn't belong here. That's the action of someone who loves this place as much as the rest of us do." As the crowd began to disperse, Elena stayed close to David. They walked together toward their vehicles in comfortable silence, both processing what had happened and what it meant for their future. "Your rule about outsiders," David said finally. "How do you feel about it now?" Elena stopped walking and turned to face him. "I think some rules exist to protect us from making mistakes. But sometimes breaking the right rule at the right time can save everything we care about." The smoke was clearing from the valley, and the first stars were becoming visible in the dark sky above Pine Ridge. David looked around at the town he'd tried so hard to become part of, the community that had finally accepted him not in spite of being an outsider, but because when it mattered most, he'd proven that home isn't where you're from, but what you're willing to fight to protect. 3 weeks after the fire, Pine Ridge looked like a town trying to remember how to be normal again. The smell of smoke had finally faded from the air, replaced by the crisp scent of early winter and the first real snow of the season. But the changes went deeper than what anyone could see or smell. David noticed it first in the way people looked at him. The polite distance was gone, replaced by something warmer and more genuine. When he walked into Frank's general store, conversations didn't stop anymore. Instead, people turned toward him with smiles and nods, often wanting to talk about the rebuilding efforts or ask his opinion about new safety measures being implemented around town. "David, good to see you," Frank called out from behind the counter. The same man who had confronted him angrily just a month before now spoke to him like an old friend. "Betty was asking if you'd be interested in helping organize the winter emergency preparedness meeting. Seems like you have some experience we could use." David was still getting used to this new version of his relationship with Pine Ridge. After months of feeling like an outsider looking in, suddenly he was being asked to take on leadership roles in the community. It felt good, but also overwhelming. "I'd be happy to help," David said. "Though I'm still learning about winter weather up here." Frank laughed. "I think we've all learned that fresh perspectives can be valuable, even when they come from people who haven't been here their whole lives." The fire had changed more than just how people treated David. It had changed how Pine Ridge thought about itself. The town council had unanimously voted to implement all the safety measures David had originally proposed, plus several additional ones suggested by the county fire department. Warning signs were being installed on hiking trails. Illegal camping would be monitored more closely, and the community was developing detailed evacuation plans for different types of emergencies. More importantly, the fire had started conversations about other changes that might benefit the town. People were talking about updating the emergency communication system, improving road maintenance to ensure fire trucks could reach all areas quickly, and even exploring the possibility of attracting new residents who might bring useful skills to the community. "We can't keep thinking that the old ways are always the best ways," Mayor Thompson had said at the most recent council meeting. "Sometimes it takes someone from outside to help us see what we've been missing." David was walking home from the hardware store when he saw Elena's truck parked in front of the temporary classroom that had been set up in the community center. The school building was being repaired, but classes were continuing in makeshift spaces around town. He hadn't talked to Elena privately since the night of the fire. Though they'd exchanged greetings and worked together on several community projects, he was debating whether to stop and say hello when Elena emerged from the building carrying a box of supplies. She saw him and smiled, the kind of real smile he'd only glimpsed a few times before. "Perfect timing," she said. "I could use some help carrying these books to my car." As they loaded the box into her truck, Elena seemed to be working up the courage to say something Finally, she turned to face him directly. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she said. "Not just the fire, but everything that led up to it. The way I handled things, the way I let fear make my decisions for me." David wasn't sure what to say. The weeks since the fire had been so focused on practical recovery that there hadn't been time for the deeper conversations about relationships and feelings that probably needed to happen. "You were in an impossible situation," he said finally. "The whole community was watching everything you did. That's just it, though. I was so worried about what everyone would think that I forgot to think about what was right." Elena leaned against her truck and looked up at the mountains where patches of burned forest were visible among the green trees. "When you spoke up about the fire danger, I knew you were right. But I was too scared to support you publicly because of my stupid rule about outsiders." "Your rule wasn't stupid. It was protecting you from getting hurt again." Elena shook her head. "My rule was protecting me from living." "There's a difference." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the early afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley. The mountains looked peaceful now, but David knew both of them would always remember the night when those same slopes had been engulfed in flames. "I've been thinking about rules in general," Elena continued, "about why we have them and when it makes sense to break them." "And what have you concluded?" Elena smiled, and David could see something different in her expression. The guardedness that had always been there was gone, replaced by a kind of openness he'd never seen before. "I've concluded that the best rules are the ones that protect what matters most. And what matters most isn't avoiding risk or protecting yourself from getting hurt. What matters most is being able to recognize when someone is worth the risk." David felt his heart start beating faster. "And have you recognized that?" "I have." Elena stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "The night of the fire, when you carried me out of that burning school building, I realized something. You weren't just saving my life. You were showing me what it looks like when someone puts the people they care about ahead of everything else, including their own safety." Elena ... "Let me finish," she said softly. "I've spent 5 years being afraid that anyone I cared about would eventually leave. But that night I realized I'd been asking the wrong question. It's not whether someone might leave someday. It's whether they're the kind of person who would stay and fight for what matters when everything falls apart." David reached out and took her hand. "And what's your answer to that question?" "My answer is that you've already proven yourself. When the town turned against you for calling the fire department, you could have packed up and left. When people questioned your motives and your loyalty, you could have decided we weren't worth the trouble. But when the crisis came, you risked your life to save a community that had treated you badly." Elena squeezed his hand gently. "That's not the behavior of someone who's just passing through. That's the behavior of someone who's found his home." David felt something settle in his chest, a feeling of belonging that he'd been chasing since the day he'd arrived in Pine Ridge. "So what does this mean for your rule about outsiders?" Elena laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet street. "I think my rule served its purpose. It protected me until I was ready to take the right risk with the right person. But now I think it's time to make a new rule." "What kind of rule?" "The kind that says home isn't about where you're born or how long you've lived somewhere. Home is about the people you're willing to fight for and the community you choose to build your life around." As they talked, people walked by on their way to various errands and activities. David noticed that no one seemed surprised to see him and Elena standing close together, talking seriously. If anything, people looked pleased, as if this was a development they'd been hoping for. Mrs. Patterson drove by slowly and gave them a knowing wave. Betty from the diner walked past carrying groceries and called out, "About time, you two." "I think the whole town's been waiting for this conversation," Elena said with a laugh. "Are you okay with that? With everyone watching and having opinions about your personal life?" Elena considered this seriously. "I've spent so much time worrying about what everyone else thought that I forgot to think about what I wanted. But I know what I want now." "What's that?" "I want to build something real with someone who's proven that he'll be here through the good times and the bad times. Someone who loves this place enough to fight for it, even when it's hard. David looked around at the town that had become his home, at the mountains that had tested him and accepted him, at the woman who had finally decided he was worth the risk. "I can't promise it will always be easy," he said. "I'm still learning how to be part of a small community. I'll probably make mistakes. We'll both make mistakes," Elena replied. "But we'll make them together, and we'll figure things out as we go." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, David realized that sometimes the best things in life come from breaking the right rules at the right time. Elena's rule about outsiders had protected her when she needed protection. But breaking that rule when she was ready had opened the door to something better than safety. It had opened the door to love, community, and the kind of belonging that comes not from where you start, but from where you choose to build your life. Standing there with Elena's hand in his, surrounded by a town that had finally accepted him as one of their own, David understood. That home wasn't a place you found. It was a place you created, one choice and one day at a time.